So, grief isn't necessarily something I explicitly talk about in my coaching. However, it's something that comes up all the time. And I quickly realized that I do talk about grief in my coaching because lots of times we're going through like life changes, we're lamenting or grieving things of the past. Often, people who are like, it's often women who are new moms, and they're grieving their lives as they were and their loss of autonomy, aging, and then, of course, like actual loss of loved ones. So, um, yeah, and grief is any loss. Um, so it comes up a lot, and I have had my fair share of loss and grief. Um, and I guess consciously, I never really wanted to do grief work, so to speak. Both, I guess, personally, but also in coaching. But like I said, it's there, it's in everything, and I have had to do a lot of my own grief and healing work. Um, well, for the past decade plus, but also specifically more so in the last few years. So I guess I wanted to just take a minute to talk about some of the lessons I have learned from grief or about grief. Um, so maybe these will resonate with you. Um, so, one is just that grief is a process and there is no right way to do it. Um, I know some people quote the like 5 stages of grief. That actually is on death and dying, not on the processing of the loss of a loved one. Um, I don't think grief is linear. I think it's forwards and backwards, and it's messy. And some people are able to mourn right away, and some people it takes them a really long time. Um, I know personally when I lost my brother 16 years ago, it took me a really long time to mourn, and to process, and there was a lot of reasons for that. Um, One was that he had suffered a lot in his mental health, and so there was a sense of relief for him and his peace, um, and also there was a lot like of things that needed to be done, like funeral stuff, um, that I took on, and uh, just taking care of other people. It just took a while for that grief, I guess, to process and me to be able to do that, to work through it. And at that time, um, everyone else had sort of moved on with their lives, and so um, I guess the reminder is that um, you take the time that you need, and there isn't a right way to do it, even though people might make you feel that way. Do you want to say anything else about that? No. I wrote a blog on this. If anyone is interested, talks a little bit more in depth, I guess, about what I'm talking about. I put it out on last week, on actually the anniversary of my brother's passing, um, and it is. I have a website. It is oliveontop.com/blog is where the blogs are, and that is the most recent one if you want to read it. So another thing that I have learned is that grief really changes you. Um, I don't know. We always have this conception that you like move through grief, um, that there's an end, or there's almost like a getting back to yourself or your life as things were, and they just aren't. They just aren't the same anymore. Your life's not the same anymore. You're not the same anymore. Um, I think there's a moving through like a heaviness, but you're never like out on the other side of grief. I feel like grief just it just kind of stays with you in some way. Um, sometimes there's this it it's just it's just there. Like even in the happiest moments of your life, there's like a bit of a sorrow that is there, because you feel that loss, depending on the relationship for you to that loss. But yeah, and so I don't really think you move through it. I think you learn how to manage it, and sometimes it's um, really intense, and sometimes it's feels normal, and then all of a sudden it feels totally bizarre and like super fresh out of nowhere. And yeah, you're never the same person. And I think part of the what is helpful is accepting that as well. I think accepting loss, um, and sometimes I talk about this with clients about um, accepting that your life is not the same. Even for, like I said, people who are new parents, grieving the old you, um, and once you are realizing that your life is never going back to the way it was, it becomes easier to obviously accept your new normal, as they say. Um, and I would say on that note, if it isn't obvious, like we're I know I've talked about this before, but we're experiencing grief right now in the pandemic, and a loss of familiarity and things that brought us joy or that we were just comfortable with, a different life. And I've talked about this, that it is, I personally think it is easier. Oh man, my Instagram just went out. My internet's real shit. I think it is easier when we accept that our lives are not going to be the same anymore. Um, that we can accept our current reality a bit better, and it gets a little bit easier than always waiting for things to go back to the way they were, because they won't. And that is just the nature of change, and that is how grief changes you. Um, so I think I was already saying this, grief is always with you. You just kind of learn how to ride the wave. I've heard it compared to waves a lot. I have used that myself, and I asked a couple of friends about how they would describe grief, and it was a similar description, quotes of which are in the blog if you're interested. But yeah, some days you're like treading water, and other days you're sinking. Um, the thing that one of the other things I learned about grief is the only real way to move through it, is to feel it, is to actually allow yourself to feel it, which sucks because it's pretty intense. And I think for me anyway, one of the most intense emotions I've ever felt. Um, but it doesn't go away unless you feel it. And like I said, it's not even like it goes away permanently, but that's how you move with it, I guess, is to, or move through it. Whatever, again, I don't think there's like an end goal with grief. Like you're just done and I never feel grief again. And just through the hardest part of it, or the most intense part of it, I guess, is to just allow yourself to feel it. and it's funny because in the last couple years, I've had to really recognize what grief is, um, and how that feels in my body. Um, I have to like name name it as such, like, oh, okay, this is grief. This is what I'm feeling. Particularly because I spent a lot of time trying to ignore it, for various reasons. And so retraining myself to be like, oh, I think what I'm feeling right now is grief. Okay, what does grief feel like in my body? It feels like a tightening in my chest and like a oh, it's like a it creeps up my neck into my throat, and I like try to swallow it down. Like, oh, that is grief. Um, and I talk about this a lot, and I talk about this with my clients a lot. We do this a lot. I do this work personally around really recognizing what emotions feel like in your body, and being able to describe them, and then being able to sit with them. Um, so often we feel an emotion, we might not even recognize it as such, but we immediately like resist and push away and distract and numb out and whatever we want to do because we don't want to feel it. But most often when we allow ourselves to feel it and name it and feel it in our bodies and be like, okay, I'm just going to feel grief, um, it feels a lot less intense. And when we tell ourselves that we can handle an emotion, um, even though in my experience grief feels pretty, sometimes it can feel unmanageable, um, that we can it doesn't feel as painful. That's not to say that like you, it's important to be feeling joy and trying to do things that feel good or even distract a bit when you're in the process of grieving, so you have capacity to like feel that. I mean, I often talk about like even containers or like setting time aside to be feeling your emotions, and then if you have to get on with certain things, then do that. um, Grief is no exception. um, yeah, I've really learned that we're really uncomfortable with grief as a society. We don't talk about it. We don't know how to talk about it. Um, we, I've experienced a fair amount of hurt from people not talking about um, my loss, or um, not naming my loved ones' names, or ask like, I think often people have the conception, particularly I think people who haven't lost somebody maybe close to them, um, that like if I bring up this person, I'm gonna upset this someone. And the reality is you're not reminding them of the fact that they've lost someone. Like, they know that. What is generally happening, and maybe I don't speak for everyone who has lost someone, but I know lots of people feel this way. It's like it feels like my loved ones being erased when nobody talks about them and nobody asks me about them, and I don't have opportunities to talk about them, and I don't feel like I can talk about them because I actually feel like I'm making people uncomfortable, because we are so uncomfortable as a society with grief and death in general. Um, so, I mean, my advice, and again, it's not everyone, but is to invite people to share stories about their loved ones or ask questions about them. I mean, you can ask if that's okay with somebody, but I'd love to hear more about so and so. They sound really interesting. Like, what were they like? What did they do? What's your favorite memory? Um, depending on your relationship, obviously, but something to consider. Um, I'm pretty sure grief stays in your body if you don't deal with it. I think, we know stress does, and chronic stress, and grief has very physiological manifestations, I guess, when you're like actively mourning, you know, like feeling sick and headaches and really fatigued and all of those things. But I think if they aren't processed, um, it gets locked up, kind of like trauma does, in your body. And yeah, I mean, I'm no scientist, but that's my impression. Um, yeah, I think the only other thing is that grief comes at really strange, inopportune times. You know, it doesn't always make sense, and can come in the middle of really happy times, or like when you're at really inappropriate times, like you're on a subway or whatever it is. Um, and if you can, I guess try to let yourself feel it if it feels like an okay time to be doing that. And the final lesson, which I already talked about, was that grief isn't just reserved to losing a loved one or even to death. It is loss, it is change, and there is no real hierarchy to it. I mean, everybody has um, a different relationship with their loss. Um, so that's it about grief.